Welcome back, everyone. For panel 2, we have Anatomy of Protest, Drivers of Dissent, and the Politics of Visibility in South Asia, which looks at the drivers of dissent and how protest movements gain visibility in South Asia. This session is chaired by Dr. Ronojoy Sen. Our speakers are Professor Nusrat Chaudhry, Professor Jeevan R. Sharma, and Professor Mohammad Wasim. I invite Dr. Ronojoy to begin.
Thank you, Tanuja. Welcome to the second session of the ISAS annual conference. As Tanuja mentioned, it's called, titled Anatomy of Protest, Drivers of Dissent and the Politics of Visibility in South Asia. Building on the first session, which sort of had a general overview of the student-led protests, in this session, the speakers will drill down into some of the specifics of the Gen Z-led changes in Bangladesh and Nepal, and the absence of a similar movement in Pakistan. We have an excellent set of panelists to undertake this task. Each speaker will have around 15 minutes or so, followed by a discussion where the audience can send in their questions. All of you already have the bios of the distinguished speakers, so I won't go over that. Without further ado, I'll invite our first speaker, Professor Nusrat Chaudhry, from the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Amherst College in Massachusetts, United States. Her talk is titled Tawhidi Janata and the Vicissitudes of Embodied Politics in Bangladesh, where she will, among other things, dwell on and dissect the term Tawhidi Janata, which stands for far-right religious mobs or a non-secular pressure group, depending on what events even prompt such labeling and by whom. Nusrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this conversation. I wish I were there, in the same time zone, but at least, happy to be able to participate. So I'm going to share my slides. So is everybody able to see? Okay, great. So taking the cue from our panel's prompt about the drivers of dissent and the politics of visibility, I'm going to talk about a particular political formation that had gained a lot of visibility since the uprising in Bangladesh in 2024. And since we already had an earlier conversation about kind of the basics of what happened in Bangladesh, I'm going to jump right into what happened right after the uprising. So nearly 8 months after a people's uprising in Bangladesh ousted South Asia's longest-running leader, Sheikh Hasina, the New York Times published an article that pointed to a culture war gaining traction on the ground. The extremists began by assuming control over women's bodies, the article wrote in April 2025. In the political vacuum that has emerged after the overthrow of Bangladesh's authoritarian leader, the article continued, religious fundamentalists in one town declared that young women could no longer play soccer. In another town, they added, they forced the police to free a man who had harassed a woman for not covering her hair in public, then draped him in garlands of flowers. End of quote. Still reeling from the unrest and uncertainty that followed 15 years of authoritarianism, Bangladeshis have been sensitive about their country's image in foreign media. Reader responses to the New York Times piece were divided. Still, the events in question were hotly debated even within Bangladesh. The first event mentioned in the New York Times took place in Rangpur in the north, where a girls' soccer match was postponed due to threats from a local madrasa. The second involved a university employee harassing a female student at Dhaka University in the capital. The man berated her, a stranger, for not wearing a scarf to cover her chest, not her hair, as mentioned in the article. The woman complained, and the man was arrested only to be freed when threatened by an angry crowd of men, ostensibly religious, that stormed the police station and later celebrated the harasser's release by welcoming him with garlands and photographing him with a copy of the Quran. These were isolated events, although in both cases, the crowds that had gathered to protest and threaten to use violence either called themselves Tawhidi Janata or were described as such in the media and by ordinary Bangladeshis. Similar crowds have since become a regular feature. They have attacked Sufi shrines, organized cow slaughter in front of a newspaper office to protest its supposed pro-India allegiance, attacked a publisher at a book fair for featuring books by a controversial author, organized rallies against the proposal of equal inheritance rights for Muslim women, and most spectacularly on February 5, 2025, razed down the residence of the first Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The historic structure, which also housed a museum, was colloquially known as the house at road number 32, or simply 32. For decades, it was a symbol of Bangladesh's path towards sovereignty and also one of its bloodiest chapters. Sheikh Mujib, the father of the recently ousted prime minister, was assassinated in the same house, along with most of his family members, by a coterie of military personnel on August 15, 1975. From the streets of Dhaka to the pages of the New York Times, Tawhidi Janata seemed to be everywhere. It stoked anxieties about the consolidation of right-wing forces in an unprecedented political vacuum. It has also been celebrated for avenging decades of secular wrongdoings. This figure of populist grievance is the focus of my very short presentation today. I approach Tawhidi Janata as a particular form of embodied politics in post-uprising Bangladesh. While the actual individuals in these gatherings belong to disparate cultural and political organizations, their emergence under the umbrella term is a significant political development. The term fuses the Arabic word tawhid, the foundational concept in Islam of the oneness of Allah, and Janata, the pan-South Asian term for people, crowd, or the mob. Starting at Sheikh Hasina's former residence in Dhaka within minutes of her departure, in the 18 months leading up to the national elections, crowds across Bangladesh have vandalized symbols and structures commemorating Sheikh Hasina and members of her family, many of which you have already seen since the 2024 uprising. They looted the properties of people with links to her party, attacked the arrested on their way to the court, forced university administrators and professors and civil servants allegedly loyal to the former government to resign, and set fire to the headquarters of 2 national dailies for their pro-India stance, which I will talk about later. As these incidents of so-called popular justice became contagious, Bangladesh was variously described by many local commentators by a mobocracy, Mobistan, the land of the mob, or Mobir Mulluk, the realm of the mob, a riff on a common Bengali expression for anarchy, Mogir Mulluk. Not all of it was hyperbolic. Between August 2024 and March 2025, vigilante attacks claimed 119 lives and injured 74 individuals. There were 179 deaths in 2024 alone, the highest annual toll in a decade. So 2 developments followed. First, Tawhidi Janata, though an older coinage, entered public consciousness and everyday vocabulary as an agent of unruly public behavior in the name of religion. And second, mob, in its English original, became the label of choice for crowd violence, even when speaking and writing in Bengali. At times, they were used synonymously. This, I argue, is not simply a semantic slippage. It speaks of the waning hegemony of a middle-class, quasi-secular rhetoric that has marked Bangladeshi politics for the better part of its existence as an independent nation. It also attests to the increased legitimacy of popular methods of adjudicating moral wrongs that regularly bypass the state. I focus on the phenomenon of Tawhidi Janata as a form of faith-based collective politics that threatens established democratic ideals and in the process is alternately celebrated and denigrated as an arbiter of popular justice. Sociologically, Tawhidi Janata is a crowd of mostly Muslim men, often but not exclusively working class. They're dedicated to guarding the reputation of the Prophet or of Islam more broadly through methods that routinely turn to violence. It came to enjoy increased attention and relative impunity in the political vacuum left in the wake of the Awami League regime. But it was not the only political entity to make its presence felt in the interregnum. Indeed, the uprising brought to the fore two overlapping categories, Chhatro Janota, or student people, and Gen Z, which also appears in the title of this conference, each of radically different vintage and boasting separate genealogies. Throughout the month of July in 2024, when public university students' agitation over government job quotas snowballed into a demand for regime change, the students who started the movement and thousands of others who joined in within days and weeks claimed the demographically specific term, which also boasts a global appeal. A number of political showdowns of the last decade or so within a few years of the Bangladesh uprising had gained traction as Gen Z protests. Making abundant use of social media networks and digital algorithm, and through massive embodied presence, a new generation born after the mid-1990s announced itself as a powerful force against a political status quo. Despite its relatively new entry into colloquial Bengali, many young protesters of the July uprising who identified themselves as Gen Z and were also interpolated as such in local and international commentaries. The poignant imagery of the July uprising that circulated well beyond Bangladesh attested to the tenacity of the ordinary, noticeably young protesters hailed as Gen Z. But what also made headlines was the jubilation when many of them stormed the National Parliament House and Ganobhavan, Hasina's official residence. Within minutes of the regime's fall, crowds had vandalized the likeness of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in portraits and statues, looted his historic house in Dhaka, or the complete destruction happened later, as I mentioned, and defaced the pictures and placards of Sheikh Hasina on public buildings. These collective attempts at erasure are best understood when read against the backdrop of a political cultism that shaped the Army League's gradual turn towards authoritarianism. It was no surprise then that the fall of the Hasina regime spurred attacks on a sacred iconography cultivated for decades. What the sudden paradigm shift also stoked was deep animosity between Bangladesh's formidable neighbor, India. A regional hegemon, India had been a pivotal support for the Awami League government for over half a century, despite the latter's recent record of human rights violations and questionable electoral victories. The fact that India offered Hasina asylum, who was otherwise believed to be partly responsible for the carnage of 2024, only consolidated deep anti-India sentiments among the masses. Tauhidi Janata has been the face of this righteous anger. The demolition of Mujib's house was the single most dramatic event in the year since regime change. It was at once the most significant and most controversial action in part of the Tauhidi Janata to date. Secular liberals, regardless of political affiliation, expressed shock and anger at this spectacular performance of illiberal politics, which they dubbed as a failed attempt at erasing history. Many others hailed it as a spontaneous expression of popular will. Some of them, including a young academic with whom I spoke a few months later, explained it this way to me, and I'm quoting, "The term Tauhidi Janata is not just imposed by the seculars. Many groups have taken out processions under this banner. They feel comfortable doing so. It's not monolithic. There are many factions of Jamaat-e-Islami, BNP, and Awami League in there too. There's also local political dynamic. For example, somebody needs to create unrest, or let's say somebody likes a piece of land owned by a Hindu person. There are also madrasa-based groups. Different groups have led movements in this name at different points." End of quote. He shared his take on Tauhidi Janata by correcting my assumption that the term was mostly used dismissively by those who condemned public or patriarchal violence, which has clearly been on the rise at the time of our conversation in June 2025. "Who recognizes the claims made by Tauhidi Janata is a matter of politics," he corrected me. He called this secular supremacism, and I quote, "Those who are calling Tauhidi Janata mob, they hold the power to name. They have the power to tag. The others try this as well. Anytime you don't like a crowd, it becomes a mob. The bottom line is, who has the power to make the label stick? Tauhidi Janata doesn't have the power or social capital. They don't have Pratham Alo or Daily Star on their side. And Pratham Alo and Daily Star are the two major dailies that have also come under attack, which I'm going to talk about in a second. His take on Tauhidi Janata was not simply a defense of the mob, which he dismissed as uneducated and therefore unworthy of his respect, but was a pointed critique of the ways in which cultural hegemony worked in Bangladesh. Tauhidi Janata, despite its presence in Bangladeshi public life since the 2000s, has evolved into a brand one could easily use but could not locate. Another interlocutor, kind of the same age as my other non-secular interlocutor, called Tauhidi Janata an open source brand. And I quote, Tauhidi Janata was there even before August 5th, which is the day Hasina fled the country, but now they can claim victimhood. Nor is it just a term of othering, it is also a self-designation. People itself is a curation. In that sense, entire Bangladesh is Tauhidi Janata. It depends on how you define ontology. End of quote. Though both these young men were approaching the topic from opposing ideological positions, the analyses around Tauhidi Janata were not always easily aligned with the secular and non-secular binary. For example, in an interview with Deutsche Welle in June 2025, Maulana Rahman, a leader of Bangladesh Islami Andolon, said, I quote, those who believe in the oneness of Allah are all Tauhidi Janata. There's no separate group by this name. Those who have Iman or faith are Tauhidi Janata. So misusing the term like this is not right. To use it as a banner and create controversy is an utterly disgraceful act. End of quote. I'm skipping here. In December 2025, just a couple of months before the elections, two very public murders once more established the mob as a key player in Bangladeshi politics, and I'm only going to briefly mention one of them. On December 12th, a 32-year-old political leader who came into visibility during the uprising was shot in the head when traveling in a rickshaw in Dhaka. Usman Hadi was the main coordinator of Inqilab Moncho, an Islamic political group. A firebrand young leader known for his unabashed anti-Awami League and anti-India sentiments was campaigning for the national elections when he was running as an independent candidate. Hadi died of his injuries a few days later in a hospital in Singapore while undergoing treatment. The brazen attempt to kill an up-and-coming populist politician and a vocal critic of India motivated ostensibly violent attacks on the offices of the two national dailies the day after Hadi died. And these are the same national dailies, Prathomalu and Daily Star, that were mentioned in my other interview. About 300 to 400 people looted and vandalized the headquarters of the same newspapers. While the offices were being ransacked, the journalists took refuge on the roof of the tall building. They had to be rescued by helicopters. So mobs have been a forceful presence, a visible presence in Bangladeshi political life following the uprising, becoming a prominent agent of politics in the same way Gen Z has made headlines leading up to the fall of the Awami League regime. The mob as a term is, of course, unsalvageable. Even those who aim to reveal what they perceived as secular hypocrisy in defining Tauhidi Janata balked at the term mob. To understand what happens to popular sovereignty following an uprising, we therefore need to pay attention to these excessively embodied agents of politics, not simply as deviants from logics of democracy, but instead as phenomena that help us readjust liberal theory by rethinking democratic participation, especially in the aftermath of authoritarianism. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nusrat, for explicating the complex idea of Tauhidi Janata and also talking a little bit about the mob. Of course, you did talk about other dimensions of the Gen Z-led movement, the anti-gender dimensions, the dismantling of Mujib's legacy, which I think sent sort of shockwaves, particularly I think in India because of India's role in 1971, and of course you also briefly touched on the relations with India, which of course these are all issues which we can come back to during the Q&A and discussion section. So we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Jivan Sharma, Chair, South Asia and International Development at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. His talk is titled Gen Z Revolt, Youth, Social Media and Political Change in Nepal, and he will be speaking on the critical role of the youth and the use of social media and the dramatic events that occurred in September 2025 in Nepal. Over to you, Jivan.
Thank you. Is my slide visible?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. So in the next 15 minutes or so, what I'm going to talk about is to give you a bit of flavor of what really happened in what we call Gen Z revolt or Gen Z uprising in Nepal, and try to kind of focus on the theme of this particular panel, on the drivers of this uprising, but also try and sort of highlight the generational element that became quite critical during the movement in it and its aftermath in the election as well. So in September 2025, Nepal witnessed a Gen Z-led protest, a youth-led political uprising rallying against the social media ban, widespread corruption, and state capture by a cartel of political and economic elite that led to a significant sort of political unrest. Inspired by Nepo kids, and this is the kind of the term that was used by the protesters, online campaign in other parts of the world. The previous weeks had been filled with the social media, the Nepali social media had been filled with videos, memes, and other materials relating to the lives of the offsprings of rich parents, Nepo kids, intercut with sorts of poverty-stricken Nepalis, particularly the migrant workers, standing in queue wearing similar caps and t-shirts in the Nepal's only international airport, which reflects the kind of stark inequalities and growing anger at the lifestyle of the affluent. So just to give you a sense of the memes over here. So on September 8th, it started as a peaceful street protest with creative slogans involving young people wearing school uniforms and carrying their identity card, as the organizers believed that doing so would deter potential police repression. In a festive mood, festive and joyful mood, they chanted slogans, clapped, played music, and sang revolutionary songs. People from other generations watched as spectators from footpath, laughed at satire, slogans, sang, and joined them in solidarity. The movement quickly turned violent by the midday, leading to political unrest that saw the killings on the very first day with 19 protesters, with over 500 injured. And eventually leading to a death of 76 people by the following day. So unlike anything that was seen in Nepal's modern history, on the next day there were targeted violent attacks on Nepal's parliament, as you can see in the picture there, the government secretariat, the Supreme Court, and the office of the president, and several businesses and private houses of politicians. So the images of these sort of attacks were widely circulated in social media. So within 36 hours, the political landscape had shifted with the resignation of the government led by KP Oli, who had to escape in an army helicopter from his prime ministerial residence, leaving a power vacuum for a few days, which was managed by the Nepal army. Eventually, following an intense political negotiation facilitated, in army's word, by the Nepal army, between the president of Nepal, the political leaders, the Gen Z activists, and others, a settlement had reached within 4 days, installing the former Chief Justice, a woman named Susila Karki, aged 73, on Friday. So started on Monday. By Friday, we already had an interim prime minister from outside of the parliament, which is quite interesting, I think, compared to, say, what we saw in Sri Lanka, for that matter. The dissolution of the lower house of parliament and the announcement of a fresh election within 6 months, which was successfully held just a couple of weeks back on 5th of March, 2026. The election saw a landslide victory, as mentioned in the previous panel by another speaker. Rashtriya Swatantra Party, RSP, emerged as a major sort of, with the landslide victory, a major political party. And if you look at the profile of the elected candidates who were elected in the election, it clearly shows a generational sort of shift. So what I do today, so this is the government secretariat. So what I'm doing over here is, I happen to be as an accidental observer in Nepal during my research sabbatical since spring 2025. So I was very much in Kathmandu, very close, within 5 minutes from the core part of Kathmandu where the protest took place. So I could hear the sound, the smell, so I was very much, engaged in that sense. I was able to kind of observe and take part in some ways on what was going on during those 2 days and the aftermath, right? So in this sort of talk, so I'm going to kind of respond to these 3 questions, but at a very superficial sort of level. But I hope I'll generate some questions that we could discuss perhaps later on. So obviously, sort of the first one, comes from the panel, sort of the blur part of this panel, the drivers of the Gen Z uprising. How did this youth-led movement emerge, and whether the movement was spontaneous as claimed by many? And I would argue, no, it was not. And the third is, what does the youth-led uprising in Nepal tell us about the nature of youth engagement in politics? And here I'm trying to kind of engage with some of the academic sort of debates in political geography and political anthropology on youth engagement in politics. So the starting point for me is that young people's lives and aspirations in Nepal or in other parts of South Asia is not their own making. It is shaped by wider political economic forces. And there are, at least I would argue, I'm focusing on these 5 sort of, key forces. First one is the demographic transition from a high mortality, high fertility society to a low mortality, low fertility society at a very short span of time. Has resulted in this sort of significant number of young people, right? So over 40% of Nepal's population currently is youth, something that we see in other parts of South Asia as well. Second, democratization process in Nepal, particularly since the restoration of democracy in 1990, all the way to the popular movement in 2006, and the constitutional settlement of 2015 has exposed Nepali youth to liberal democratic values, human rights, equality, justice, etc. And as we can see that there is a sort of exposure of youth to middle class sort of lifestyle through use of internet, social media, globalization, urbanization. Yet the actual practice that young people often face in securing jobs or accessing services, as they have experienced, is shaped by conflict of interest, nepotism, predatory clientelism, etc. Right? And the final point, I just want to kind of highlight the kind of economic policy that has been adopted by the Nepali government in modern Nepal's history, starting, you could argue from the recruitment of Nepali men in the British Army, has been through, a third of Nepal's GDP is remittance basically contributes to a third of Nepal's GDP. Lack of jobs have meant government has systematically begun to export Nepali men, all these sort of, men to overseas employment as migrant workers in GCCs or in East Asian economies. And the economy effectively, therefore, has survived on consumption-based model, right? So remittances are sent, and then that is what is fueling consumption. That is what is, because of consumption, there is significant sort of import of consumable goods. That's what, I think over 50% of Nepal's sort of revenue comes from import tax, for example. So migrant worker, the kind of economic model that has been adopted by the Nepali state has led to a kind of a conjuncture in terms of youth futures and youth predicaments in that sense. So very quickly, I didn't have nice visuals. So the first bullet point you can see are some of the slogans, kind of very Gen Z slogans, right? So particularly if you look at "We Pay, You Flex" is one of them. So these are some of the slogans that have been used by the Gen Z activists, both online as well as offline, during the peaceful protest that we saw on 8th of September and the 9th of September, much more violent in that sense. And I just want to kind of highlight that, what do these slogans actually mean, right? So, and the other point I wanted to kind of highlight is this the movement was not spontaneous as it has been claimed often in international media, that, oh, well, this is sudden, nobody saw it coming. But if you look at the history of, or the biographies of some of the activists who have been involved in these movements, and I can directly, based on the interviews with several activists and others, I can trace their activism to significant a kind of social politics, or what Craig Jeffrey has called generative politics over the last decade or so in particular. But the history of it goes all the way up to at least 2 decades. The kind of anti-corruption movements that these young people have been engaged in, or during the earthquake of 2015, many of these activists were engaged in relief and humanitarian work. During COVID pandemic, they had basically built their reputation and honed their skills during these humanitarian or human rights campaigns on Dalit Lives Matter, or on gender-based violence, on anti-corruption. So there was a kind of brewing of these kind of momentum, and of course it was not political in the sense of student-led politics. That is what often we think of youth engagement in politics. It was a very different kind of politics, a kind of politics of reform, politics where they saw that they are different to that of the politics done by old men or by student, university politics, right? So what we also saw was, as I indicated briefly, the kind of widespread use of social media and the politics of visibility. In Nepal case, because of the social media ban just a few days before, social media was very much implicated in the kind of mobilization, right? It was not just that social media was used to mobilize people and to kind of, circulate the kind of not just in the circulation of images and so on. Social media had become the kind of one of the cause or the drivers for this particular movement. The government had banned 26 platforms for failing to register with the government of Nepal, and they had given them ultimatum, and that is the sort of context in which it came about. What I also wanted to highlight was the significant participation of Nepali diaspora and Nepali migrants in the social media, right? And that has been largely underestimated, because one of the sort of concerns that has been raised in the public sphere in Nepal has been, with a large number of Nepalis, particularly youth living outside of Nepal, they have not been able to shape Nepali politics. No longer. Even if they are not voting, they had taken, as we could see during the Gen Z protests, they actually took part in protest, right? So they actually took part in politics, not by voting, by taking part in this particular movement, by retweeting, by circulating reels and TikTok video messages and so on. I'll quickly finish, Ronjoy. I don't know how much time I've got. I can't see the message, but I'll take maybe about a couple of minutes if that's okay. Very quickly, going on to the election, because I thought, I'm not going to kind of focus on this, but one aspect I want to highlight was election did take place on time, within 6 months, on 5th of March. It led to a landslide victory of new political party, RSP, leaving the Nepal's established political parties far behind. So the new party came almost close to 2/3 majority, something not seen in Nepal's political history, right? So it projects itself as a new political party led by a new generation, promised to change the sort of departure from old patronage-based politics led by what they call three old men, right? So in this sense, I also sort of bring in the gendered aspect in addition to the generational aspect. It was very much against the sort of the old men. There is a kind of gendered aspect which also explains why RSP got a lot of vote from women, older women as well, not just younger sort of women in that sense, right? So the final point is also quite interesting. The new political party, like Rashtriya Swantantra Party, or there are other, another outfit called SSP Shram, which is very much based on, labor, sort of the idea of labor, right? So the idea of Shram. That political party had a significant percentage of candidates under 35 years old in the election. The established political parties had 2%, 3%, and 6%. Nepal has mixed electoral system in PR system and FTTP. And these political parties had over 20, 26, 30% of the candidates in the election were under 35, something not seen in Nepal's political history. So therefore generational, not just in terms of the protest, but also in a substantive sort of sense. So as a result, we have seen a significant sort of different sort of outlook in Nepal's parliament, which is going to sit, next week for the first time. A different demographic has taken over. So I guess just to conclude, what I've tried to do over here is to focus the gaze on the political economic pressures and the predicaments that young people have faced in this particular sort of, conjunctures that they have found themselves in. That the politics is generational, but also gendered against the masculine politics by old men. One rooted in social activism, social action, involving various campaigns and projects. And these are largely based on the biographies of some of these activists that I've been following. So the final point I want to make is what we see is this sort of youth engagement in co-creation of democracy through socio-political mobilization based on generational question. So young people are not just sort of engaged in predatory sort of clientelism or the kind of being the pawns of political parties or uninterested sort of in politics, but engaged in creative kind of politics, which appears to have brought in not just a symbolic sort of sense, but in a substantive sense that it has elected a young parliament in Nepal's political history. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeevan, for giving us a broad overview, but also giving us some specifics of the politics in Nepal since September 2025. You did talk about the what you term the youth predicaments, which is of course not it's common not just to Nepal, across South Asia, and one could argue even globally. Also the Gen Z slogans that I'm sure you probably had much more to talk about, if you didn't have the time constraints. And finally, the elections of recently in March 2026, when you had a new political party actually investing what you call the three old men, the older sort of the political establishment. And that's something we can come back to. The outcome in Nepal was quite different from the electoral outcome in Bangladesh, and that's something that we could come back to in the discussion section. So now we can move on to our final speaker, Professor Mohammad Wasim, and his talk will be somewhat different. It's titled "Absence of a Pakistan Youth Movement," where he will dwell on the absence of a visible rise in youth activity off or on campus in Pakistan, unlike Bangladesh and Nepal, which aimed to bring down the regime of the day. Professor Wasim, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi. So I requested screen sharing. Probably I'll be helped.
Professor Wasim,
Yes.
I think your sound, I think maybe now it's clearer. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, probably I'll speak louder a little.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
fine.
okay, yes. So first of all, youth politics in Pakistan, a South Asian perspective means, obviously, whatever has happened in the three countries, why hasn't it happened in Pakistan? So the first uh,
Professor Wasim, I think you need to unmute. You've muted yourself.
very kind.
Yeah.
So, the previous speaker has talked about the longish sort of process of the coming up of the movement, but I also, in my uh, framework, have talked about it. For example, that all the three movements have a history spread over months or probably longer than that. But the youth upsurge took place unexpectedly. For example, a month before or a week before the event itself, it was not predictable. In that sense, of course, whatever has happened, so this will be what I am going to talk about. Was it a progressive movement? Of course, against corruption, against repression, but what has happened? We have gone back to the elections. That means the same political class? Most probably, yes, even though there was a kind of a generational transition in the case of Nepal. But overall, we can say the same political class and a mere change of guards, was it? For example, these three countries have had a kind of an upsurge where the class basis didn't change of the government and of the state itself, and of course, so many other things which happened in the revolutions. Frankly, there was the same rules of game followed. For example, the political parties fighting elections and the establishment was there very much. I'll talk about it later. So each case unrelated to others, that's very important because there was internal dynamics in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and in Nepal. For example, they are geographically not contiguous, even otherwise politically did not influence each other's politics so much. And therefore, I would say that the roots of the upsurge lay very much within the country. And of course, then there was digital activism. Everybody has talked about it. But what has happened? That kind of digital activism lacked organization, which means for in some other place probably uh, it would have been better organized. But here, narrative was totally binary in the sense that it was us and them, it was evil and good. And of course, then there was very short term upsurge in the sense that it was a matter of days only when all the property was gone, it was destroyed, and whatever happened, which captured the attention of the TV, the world over, and it was personalized. For example, it was Sheikh Hasina in one case, and of course, the Prime Minister of Nepal in the other case, and other boxes. So there was no community building at large. So here, what happened was that the politics of the left and politics of the right both were rendered obsolete because we needed something more than these two terms to explain these movements. So next, please, if you could help. Here it is then, the youth movement, a bird's eye view. For example, youth bulge via high fertility rate. It has been talked about. It's not totally related to today's discussion. But movements against elected governments, remember, because there is now a divorce between elections and democracy. And these are two separate phenomena. We have to take into account this particular fact. And of course, issues did take place and they did trigger the movement. But look at the narrative of the movement. These were for systemic change. They were talking about the system without defining what kind of change they wanted, except, of course, that the leader must go. And the leaders did go, but was it a systemic change? Here, for example, the civil society, there is a bit of criticism here that it was rendered apolitical because of NGOization, but I don't want to elaborate on that. Let's move to Gen Z, which was against establishment. But who restored peace? Establishment. Who managed the transition in the government and who held elections? Imagine the deep state was doing it all. A focus on, for example, entrance legitimacy. For example, in Nepal, there was the demand for executive presidency, as if an elected president would have behaved differently. So, in fact, there should have been a focus on the performance legitimacy because they were talking constantly about corruption and, of course, dynasticism. So, we need to move. And there, I would say that uh, the let me talk about the next thing. The post factum resurgence of the system. Was the system destroyed? No. Post election governance, for example, in Sri Lanka's case, corruption cases bypassed the ruling party. This happened, for example, and particularly Rajapaksa's. So, what has happened? The old culture of impunity was revived. It has revived in these three countries after the elections. Uh, so, even the repressive laws stay on the statute book. And of course, in Bangladesh, BNP's accountability agenda. And imagine when it was in power in 2001 to 2006, there was quite a bit of talk about whatever was going wrong with the economy and whatever by way of corruption. So again, National Citizens Party, the youth party in Bangladesh, was defeated. So what message does it give to us? With a revolution, was it some kind of a change? How real is the change? And of course, from anti-corruption to politics of the right. In India, for example, if you remember, under Congress, from secularism, there was a shift to the politics of religion. And Anna Hazare to Modi, does it happen everywhere? Will it happen? For example, in Bangladesh and of course Sri Lanka and Nepal, these movements led to what? Somewhat, particularly in Bangladesh, it led to the right, which means to politics of religion. There has been some kind of an upsurge. So from the rotten control freaks to the newly mandated regulators. So I hope I'm fair to the youth which laid their lives for the movement. So here in Pakistan, youth politics, there has been legacy of the state in British India. The most elaborate system of rule as a pyramid, centralized on top and decentralized at the bottom. There has been this particular legacy which is and has been in place for so many decades. So here, student politics was and has been usually linked to political parties. They always represent youth wings of the parties themselves. So, PPP, for example, in the 1969 to 75, 74 particularly, here was the populism of the left, and youth was very much a potent factor. But usually, the heyday of student politics in that period declined. And these are banned student organizations for the last 40 years. The students, particularly youth, has not been very much visible on the road by way of a kind of a revolutionary mobilization. Youth politics along ethnic and religious lines. What has it done? There is a kind of an impediment on the way to horizontal mobilization because ethnicity cuts them. Baloch, Pashtun, Sindhi, Punjabi, they tend to be on different lines, in fact, opposite lines, and these cut across the generational mobilization. So, how to say in another way, student activism, it has been very much there in place. Okay, youth politics in Pakistan, yes, Dynasticism has been the target, inflation, corruption, unemployment, all these issues which led to student, particularly youth, upsurge in these three countries. They are there in Pakistan, but there has been a deficit of mass support. This is where Pakistan has been a bit different. And there I would move further that there is a kind of uh, half expectation. Is youth upsurge going to happen in Pakistan? For example, political instability is very much there. There is anti-dynastic, anti-corruption movements, leading, for example, to Imran Khan's populism of the right in 2018, 2022, and even after uh, he left the power, even 3 years after that, he continues to be on the horizon. But is the movement there? That's the problem. Economic crisis, 2023, we were close to sovereign default to IMF, like in Sri Lanka, but there was something which didn't happen by that particular framework. So there is hyperinflation, inequality. The highest in South Asia is in Pakistan, not in India, not in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. No, in Pakistan. And currently, for example, 3 months back, there were the figures out that there are 41% people in Pakistan who live below poverty line, but nothing is moving. So there is social media, for example, as PTI's digital fund. But the problem is that it's focused on the agenda of Imran's release from jail. There is no policy content and no ideological content, and that is a kind of a restraint on the uh, operation of the movement and the end product of the movement, if at all. A youth movement converging on Islamabad? Hardly likely. Not visible on the horizon, despite political grievances which are being shared with the neighboring countries. So initially I wanted to talk about India and Pakistan, but I don't know much about India, and I have mainly talked about Pakistan itself. And here, lastly, I would have a kind of a an oh, a, a a perspective. What is it? What was it? These youth movements, which have happened in three countries, which have not happened in Pakistan, these movements, these hit the political veneer of the establishment. That is, the elected part, those who were elected into office by the people, leaving the deep state in charge, which of course managed the transition. That seems to be pointing to the fact that the power brokers in the end were not hit hard. Top leaders as evil incarnate. What does it mean? It means, of course, that the objectives were limited. When you say remove him or her, and that will be the panacea out there waiting for us, no, this did not happen. The system is too strong for persons in charge. Gen Z, for example, that movement was not sustainable. How? First of all, it was lean on leadership. Nobody led. That means there was a kind of crowd which was there, as the first speaker talked today. These were organized in a, there was no organizational composite, there was no organization and no composite counter narrative. Again, narrative was very much centered on persons and, of course, hatred, which had been, in a way, which had boiled the blood of the younger generation, but needed to be, in a way, managed well. There was no future planning, for example, which way we want to go. So regime change through extra constitutional means, yes, but it is a new normal. For example, there are quite a few examples in near history. Philippines, people power, for example, and of course, then there are these three revolutions. In the end, I can say that there were loudest protesters, but not representing the quietest people in these countries. Minorities, women, peasantry, industrial labor. Meaning what? Were these middle class movements? Most probably youth which comes out to the street belongs to that particular social stratum. And I would say that that happens in the third world countries where democracy has taken roots, but democracy in the sense of electoral democracy. Elections are part and parcel of the imagination of the people. Is it a break? Is it a constraint which operates on the minds of the young people? Because both the objectives and the strategies are constrained by the fact that there is some kind of election, and that election, although
I think we might have lost Professor Wasim, or maybe Professor Wasim, can you see and hear us? I can see his screen. Professor Wasim, are you still there?
I think we lost him.
We might have lost him, and I guess he was Professor Wasim
Anyway,
was,
wrapping up. Yes.
wrapping up. So we can maybe move on to the question answer discussion segment, even as I'm hopeful that Professor Wasim can come back online fairly soon. But I think that was sort of a healthy dose of skepticism that was injected by Professor Wasim when he was talking about the absence of youth movement in Pakistan. He was also talking about the weaknesses, perhaps, of these so-called Gen Z movements elsewhere in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And I quite liked that the phrase that he used, the loudest protesters, not representing the quietest or those in the periphery, and he talked, include minorities, women, peasants, labor, etc. So we hope he'll be back. So I again invite the audience to send in their questions. But even as they do, I have a couple of questions which are sort of open. They can be answered by any of the presenters. But one specifically for Nusrat, and you did a great job of talking about the Tawhidi Janata, but a question that's relevant both to Bangladesh and Nepal is the question of violence that accompanies, of course, any sort of whenever there's a mob present, there is, of course, violence is almost ancillary to that. And could you talk a little bit more about that? How violence is a sort of category that's ever present in these movements. And of course, you also talked about how the election campaign in Bangladesh itself, which I believe was different from Nepal, and Jeevan, you might correct me, where you saw a lot of violence, and of course you talked about the sort of assassination or the killing of Usman Hadi, right? So the campaign itself was also violent, and that kind of leads me to a sort of we don't get sidetracked, but a question of you find Gandhi, and I teach a course on Gandhi, so I'm particularly interested. He had been sort of Gandhi and Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence. You've seen sort of been present in movements across the world, and of course, if you go back to the civil rights movement in the US, etc. But we don't see his name or or any of his ideas actually sort of circulating, closer home, and closer time. I was kind of interested whether if you had any thoughts on that. And second question,
including India.
Pardon? Even
Including
within India, right?
Yeah.
Although you did have
I
people
think, that's a very good question, and that's something that kind of haunts all these conversations, right? But violence is kind of, what Thomas Blom Hansen has called the lingua franca right? In our political culture, it has become a lingua franca. But I think, I'm very much sympathetic to Professor Wasim's skepticism. I feel bad that we lost him. Maybe he lost power or something.
Yeah, I'm hoping he'll
But
be
at the
back.
same time, I think it's important to understand the conditions of possibility of these movements, right? So and of course that how Nepal also needs to be understood in this kind of longer historical context. So, of course, I am of the camp where I think that, what I think of as a revolutionary politics actually happens differently. There's grassroots organizing and, all kinds of things that we kind of, all these ideas and praxis related to revolutionary change that we have inherited. But at the same time, when you actually look at the longue durée of political culture, if you have, I mean, let's just, simplify things. Let's just say that Awami League became particularly, authoritarian, I would say from, 2014. That's the election that was, kind of widely believed to be rigged, and all that. Even if it was, let's say, 12 years or 10 years of kind of repression, that creates a certain kind of culture, right? So all these, Gen Z or whatever you want to call them, the generation that has come of age politically has come of age by seeing, what power looks like. And power looks, and functions in a very particular way. So the kind of, sorry, my cat decided to join the conversation. So the kind of, organizing, the kind of political pedagogy, I think, that is kind of important for the kind of democratic, uprising or the aftermath that we would ideally want is very difficult when, you have been, taught to understand power in a very particular way. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, like what is the context in which this was happening. And again, to go back to what Professor Wasim was saying, and I was just reading this in the New York Times about the US and Iran, farce that we have been watching. The decapitation is never the answer, right? So you get rid of people at the top. That doesn't necessarily, have a kind of trickle down effect. It doesn't automatically democratize society. But at the same time, the kind of authoritarianism that we have seen, I'm only going to speak about Bangladesh here, that becomes kind of not just symbolic, but that becomes the starting point, right? So when we have this like long-standing dynastic tradition that, you kind of, by default of being part of a family, that you are going to, kind of claim this power and then, sustain this power through force and violence, then decapitation, getting rid of who's on top becomes very, very important because it wasn't a kind of democratic system to begin with. So I think to understand why the kind of Gandhian nonviolence, hasn't been the dominant mode of doing politics, I think we have to understand that in these parts of the world, that kind of politics hasn't been very successful or active for a long time. So the generation that's coming of age now, politically, hasn't really seen anything else. That's unfortunate, but I think that's something important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Nusrat.
Yeah, very, very briefly, I think you asked a very important question. Yeah, we didn't see Gandhi in Nepal's Gen Z uprising, but we saw peace in the sense that the Gen Z activist had actively called for a peaceful protest, peaceful on-street protest. They had even taken permission from the administration.
Institutions, but the campaign itself.
Yes, so I'll come to that. So intention-wise, it started like that. What we saw was the kind of, the police or the state response on day one seemed quite repressive because Within a couple of hours, we saw 19 protesters killed, many injured. The last time something like that happened in Nepal was during the regime change, or during the kind of getting rid of monarchy in Nepal. It took 19 days, 19 people got killed, and the entire system got replaced, right? So what we saw was the kind of police repression on day one. Day two, interestingly, you could argue that the mob took over, started attacking, all these sort of political symbols of political establishment, parliament, Supreme Court, the media, private businesses, targeted, not randomly. It is very sort of telling in that sense. But we did not see the police presence. One would have thought that police would have been much more moderate on day one, would have gone after the day two, right? So I think peace, the concept of peace and violence, also needs to be contextualized in the kind of the empirical context in which we see both the movement, or we can call it movement, and the counter movement, or whichever side we find ourselves in. So that would be my brief answer. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeevan. We have quite a few questions trickling, but before I move on, there's just a second question that I had on the the different outcomes, possibly in Bangladesh, where we had the kind of establishment, a party, the BNP coming back, whereas in Nepal, of course, we have this new political, formation. And the question is, of course, they represent sort of different outcomes, but just to also bring in Professor Wasim, does that really sort of unsettle some of the, the earlier sort of formations, the sort of political class or the elite class, in a way that, so Wasim was saying that it actually does not? Maybe could we have, all three of you sort of address that question on the outcome, or at least the immediate outcome of the student-led or the Gen Z movements?
I think
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Professor
Please.
Wasim, why don't you begin?
Yeah.
Okay, the electoral dynamics has captured the imagination of South Asian countries. British India lasted for more than 100 years. Even the oldest men and women sitting in remotest villages in Pakistan, for example, and I'm sure in other countries, they are inspired by the fact that, yes, there is something called ballot, and it matters. Whenever it does, for example, 5 years from the last ballot, whatever. The point is that once the legislators get elected, then there is no need for the constituency. They are abandoned. There is quite a bit of talk, for example, about politics of patronage, which goes on in an unequal transaction between those who are on top and those who simply have the power to vote. So, meaning thereby that that this is a kind of an arrangement for keeping the system from moving in a direction which is not, let's say, suitable for those who ultimately carry power in the country. So, elections, number one, these are, in a way, they are a limiting factor, let's say. This is not to say that, yes, there should be a kind of a communist revolution or something, but the point is that there are 3 or 4 or 5 or other examples where there have been movements which brought down the powers that be. For example, in Pakistan, anti-Ayub movement, for 5 months, he went down. But how? Change of guards. He transferred power to General Yahya. Anti-Bhutto movement, 5 months long. And who came to power? General Zia. The point is that this is a change within the establishment. And that means, yes, people come to the road very much committed to change. They lay their lives, they get injured. There is quite a bit of life at stake, but that has to be in some way meaningful in the larger sense, where ends and the processes are controlled and taken in a certain direction. That is not there. And therefore, I would say the crowd takes over. And that means that the establishment far more established those who are in power in business, in land owning, in military, in bureaucracy, they are there. Nobody talked, for example, about the bureaucracy, which is the state itself. It operates through the departments of all the kinds. Did anybody hit an officer, for example, of a department? And not particularly one person, but what I'm saying is, as a class, the powerful ones were able to escape from the anger of the masses. So somehow it looks like the fact that these kinds of movements, they are welcome because they represent a societal input from the masses. But will they change? That's a question which I couldn't answer in the context of these particular movements. And of course, Pakistan suffers from all these ailments, all these grievances, but there is no prospect of moving in that direction. Yeah.
Right. Nusrat and Jeevan, any quick interventions on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that has already been said, but I just want to, as somebody who studies crowd politics, I think crowds are very important because I just don't know how else could, what happened in Bangladesh would have happened. But again, the uprising is an event, but democratization is a process. So obviously, it's kind of hard to understand or even predict how a process is going to unfold by just looking at an event. And these kinds of events also create conditional and contingent solidarities and alliances, right? So one of the reasons why NCP, has lost, yes, I mean, there are many reasons why NCP, the National Citizens Party, lost, for very, predictable reasons. But NCP has not been seen as representative of, the people, all the young people who have participated for a long time in Bangladesh. So there are many women who there are many, kind of the more lefty, more secular, kind of people with those kinds of political positions have long felt kind of sidelined. And a lot of them have kind of left the project of, NCP even before it became a party. And after it formed alliance with Jamaat-e-Islami, many others who, stuck out actually decided to leave. So, NCP's failure is not really seen as the student movement's failure in that sense, because it has lost a lot of the people who were behind it, at the beginning. So just, I think that it is important to make the distinction between event and process. And it is true that the outcome or the way things are unfolding now seem like it's just basically status quo. But, there are many reasons why that is the case. And one of the reasons why a lot of people kind of across the political spectrum in Bangladesh were excited about the elections is because of this kind of question of stability. And that has been a real problem with, crowds of, all kinds of, kind of, yeah, all kinds of events that made it seem like any kind of political stability was welcome, even if it means that it's going back to, some kind of a status quo.
Right, yeah, stability and status quo, yeah, often go in hand in hand.
Very briefly.
Jeevan, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think caution is needed. I agree, caution is needed. Of course, we don't know. It's a developing story how things might evolve. But we've been there before, right? In Nepal, look at Maoist insurgency and the sort of landslide victory. That they became one of the biggest. Well, they were the biggest political party in the election afterwards, and we've seen what has happened to that now, right? People have voted for change, but I think at the same time, I think there are a few things. I think one really important thing which we've not really talked about is, even in Nepal, we know Nepal army was instrumental. So in facilitating the kind of political settlement, right? It has been important in conducting the election. So I think if you think about political establishment, Nepal army, its role cannot be ignored. At the same time, I'm not willing to ignore the role of Nepal's youngest parliament in the sense. I think there is a sort of generative force that is there. It's very likely that the economic political structures are intact, as we know, and they will, of course, attempt in different ways to try and overcome, what we've seen in this sort of momentous sort of event. But I think we have to wait and see, and I'm willing to kind of give, I think things are different. I've not called it a revolution for a reason. I've called it a rupture or revolt in that sense. But it has left us with lots of possibilities, and we've seen in Nepal case within 6 months to have a parliament that is as age-wise, generation-wise very different is important. It's not everything, but it's important. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. The story is still unfolding. I think that's also an important thing to keep in mind. So we have a lot of questions. So we'll just, there's one general question which I'll throw out to the panel, and maybe all of you might have seen it from Sandeep Bhardwaj, my colleague, which says, he's asking to what degree the public dissatisfaction in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh was caused by government failure versus the structural factors such as economy, demographic shifts, social divisions, etc., at the risk of cynicism. To what degree can change in government solve the problems of these countries? And this sort of goes back, I think, to the discussion maybe we were having around, Professor Wasim's view. But if you wanted to add anything to that, or do you think we've already kind of probably addressed this issue to some extent? Any of the panelists? Yeah, I guess if not, we can just quickly move on. Since we have a few questions, maybe I'll throw them out, two at a time. So we have one from Yugdeep Airi asking about Pakistan in specific. So after 2024 elections, Pakistan, there were some protests, and I guess this is addressed to Professor Wasim. So don't you think Indo-Pakistan conflict of 2025 and the recent Pakistan-Afghanistan war keeps Pakistani population overlap? I guess the question is, whether these sort of distract the Pakistani population maybe from the real, problems. Professor Wasim, do you have a?
This is strange that this time the latest round of hostilities between the two countries did not move to a war psychosis, probably because it was only 4 to 5 days that they fired at each other, and probably that there were no ground troops involved. They even did not attack each other by sending aircraft. They only used missiles sitting in their own countries, both of them. Mass mobilization wasn't there the way it had been in the previous wars. So what I see is that that was one, that the damage was limited and the duration was limited too. Thirdly, the developments in the region have overtaken whatever is happening. There, Pakistan happens to be a kind of a frontline state. We are on the Gulf, and Iran is next door. We have got, let's say, 900 kilometers long frontier with Iran. There might be some kind of an overflow of hostilities, or maybe population, part of it might seek refuge across the border or something. So I would say that the world has moved on to another region which is close by, where Pakistan has some kind of a role, and where India doesn't have a specific role by way of, for example, a defense alliance like Pakistan has entered into one, which is not very significant if we don't judge it in the context of whatever is going on now that America and Israel have invaded Iran, and suddenly the Arab countries have been involved. So what I'm saying is that population is the way it is. It did not go deep enough in the two countries. I can talk about Pakistan. It seemed that there is a kind of an automatic recline into hostility wherever something happens. For example, Pahalgam happened in India, and that led to a kind of narrative, first of all, and that led to the requirement of the government in India to take some action. So we are in a way caught in the pressure of the public at a given time. In India, this happened, and Pakistan responded, and that's how the event was thankfully limited.
Right. So I just clubbed two questions now together. One is where the question about whether politics is increasingly reduced to a battle against corruption rather than sort of any programmatic vision, and this the question is on Bangladesh specifically, but I think it applies also to Nepal as and the other South Asian country. And the other sort of related question is how the idea of democracy is now seen by the sort of Gen Z movement, and this kind of ties into something that was mentioned in the first discussion about how do you sort of measure democracy, how these movements are feeding into sort of democracy, grassroots democracy, etc. So the idea of whether we need to restructure the idea of democracy itself. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
Just very quickly, corruption was one of the issues that
Right.
came up in the Bangladesh uprising, which started by this, protesting this quota system that would give kind of a leg up for the families of freedom fighters, which was readily seen as a kind of pro-Awami League, move. But I think, unlike in Sri Lanka, although Sri Lanka is also a little bit more complicated, but unlike in Nepal, at least from whatever little I know, the predominant, aim here or the predominant topic here was not corruption. It was only part of the story. There was also, this is why Tauhidi Janata, I think, is kind of important to talk about, because there was also a kind of there were deep grievances against the kind of ideology that had become kind of sanctified, in the last, however, decade and a half in Bangladesh, which was, kind of officially mandated by the Awami League, which is the narrative of 1971. So that's why the whole quota reservation for freedom fighters was seen readily as yet another Awami League ploy. So I think there was a lot of kind of ideological, the grievances were also on the level of ideology, in addition to corruption.
Right. Any thoughts? Jeevan? Yeah.
Very briefly, I think I would go back to one of the slogans that in the Nepal protest we saw called ban corruption, not connection, right? So I think it was very much about corruption. So therefore, we could sort of, in some ways, the kind of political movement we saw was absolutely not ideological in a sort of traditional left and right sense. I think it is very clear. It is very much targeted against both of those. We also saw that not just during the movement, but also in the electoral outcomes, how the traditional political parties who have been sort of, doing politics, ideological sort of politics, have been kept reduced to a very little sort of, margins in that sense. So I think, so it is definitely, to answer the first question, corruption was a major sort of mobilizing kind of factor. And it's also to do with, therefore, the kind of project that the new political forces are projecting is to do away with that, right? So how do you then, the whole idea on governance, the whole idea on service delivery, and kind of techno kind of populist sort of ideas that have come to fore, and therefore some cause of sort of concern. But I think it also allows us, who says that delivery and governance is not a kind of ideology, right? It may not fit the kind of traditional sort of notion of political ideology. Perhaps we also need to pay attention to a different kind of ideologies that are being ideated through these movements, right? And there was, just to go back to, I think, the previous question also, before this was, to what extent we can attribute it to corrupt governance and structural. I think I would like to see that question from the vantage point of youth who took part in person, but also online, right? So I think it is about political response. The structural kind of conditions in itself do not, generate political mobilizations, right? So how do young people through these kind of mobilizations respond in a way they did or do, right? Of course, the Gen Z activists in Nepal did not start the peaceful protest with the ambition to try and overthrow the regime. They were simply gathering, just like similar gatherings that had taken place, at least 25 of them in the past 10 years, in the same mandala, in the same square, by the youth activists. But those movements, just, people came, went home. But this movement did go further and met with sort of, weak police presence. They wanted to occupy, similar to what they had seen, say, in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh, to occupy the parliament, met with police repression, and things just, so this was not scripted in a way I would like to read it, right? It was completely unexpected. Some Gen Z activists had even urged their sort of constituency to go home because things had gone beyond control. But, Nusrat is here, thinking about sort of, crowd politics and how it unfolds at moments like that. So thank you.
Right. The unpredictability, I guess, is something that we also have to keep in mind. Right, so I think we're really running out of time. So there's one final question that maybe I can sort of throw out by Carter Hudson, which I think has partly been sort of addressed, but again, based on Professor Wasim's statement on how removing the top leader is far from enough to enact sort of comprehensive political change, and how will the sort of new or young leaders be able to effectively go after sort of long-standing institutions and fundamentally change the ecosystem? Will it take the form of working with older and more experienced individuals that are in line with the movement, et cetera, et cetera? So maybe some final thoughts on that. And again, it ties into some of the things that we've been discussing all this while.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Nusrat, go ahead.
no, please go ahead.
Okay,
I think
responses from all of you.
Nusrat, I'll just give a very brief response. I think to me, we've seen the army, sort of response that I gave earlier. Army was very important, has remained intact in the context of Nepal, and has played an important role, as we know, in other contexts as well. And also that the fact that Nepal's interim prime minister, Chief Justice, women, but nonetheless a 73-year-old, and all the advisors and other kind of people that young people are turning to do come from not necessarily Gen Z. I think I agree with the previous statement someone made that Gen Z allows or has an international appeal, right? But there was an intergenerational participation in the movement. If you look at both during the movement, but also in the election, we could see particularly from women, as I mentioned. So yes, with army and the sort of the old political establishment, they are not going away in that sense. But the agenda and the leaders are from new generation, and that is what gives me a bit of cautious optimism at this point. So thank you.
Nusrat?
Yeah, very quickly, I do want to highlight the point Professor Wasim made about bureaucracy. I think, it's just one of those, nobody ever goes and picks up a fight. I mean, they do, but not in the same way, at the secretariat or what have you, right? I mean, it is really, the kind of institution that runs everything. And I think all of us, at least in Bangladesh, most of us agree that the interim government has not been very effective or efficient for a number of reasons, and many of them have come out and actually said that they wanted to do a lot of things, but the bureaucrats didn't let them, or that the bureaucracy didn't cooperate. So it is important to keep in mind that even when a government came with so much like people's affective investment in it, was still not getting the kind of treatment from a deeply politicized bureaucracy. So that's something important to keep in mind. But maybe because I'm from South Asia, or maybe because I'm from Bangladesh, I'm happy with very little. Whatever gains, whatever wins we have. So even in 1990, when we had a movement against also started at Dhaka University, a student movement against Irshad, we actually ended, a decade and a half or more of military rule, and we introduced democracy and we introduced parliamentary democracy. Yes, we have seen a farce of it, but it is there. And with this new kind of a post-uprising government, there is, the caretaker government has been brought back, and there are other kinds of reforms that, there's still a lot of negotiation going on. So I will take the wins and see, where how this process unfolds.
We can end on an optimistic note, but Professor Wasim, do you have a very quick final word?
Well, I would say that there used to be military coups in so many countries, Pakistan particularly. Now they've learned to use democracy itself to control people's ambitions. So that system is not challenged. So bring their representatives to office, collaborate with them, use them, and thereby the deep state in a way manipulates those who have some kind of legitimacy by way of being elected, and that's a better way of keeping the crowd under control. This is what I think has happened and would happen. You open when there is a loud knock at the door, then you open the door, get them in, and then close the door. So some new entrants, I hope that I don't sound very pessimistic, but I feel that the system is intact. Thereby, democracy has become the focus of all of our hopes, forgetting that democracy was born out of the capitalist interests, where they felt they should have the election and get the legitimacy from the people who would vote for them. So that function of democracy, the basic and the initial function of democracy, has to be kept in mind. We should not raise our hopes very high.
Right, some caution to temper the, maybe the cautious optimism of the panelists. I think we unfortunately have to bring this discussion to an end. I won't even try and summarize. I think there were a lot of ideas thrown up. It was a very rich discussion, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of these themes and some themes over the next 1.5 days. On that note, should I just hand it over to Tanuja? Do you have any announcements to make?
Yes, I just want to say thank you very much to the chair and speakers for the discussion. We'll now break for lunch, and panel 3 will resume at 5 p.m.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.